Alright, YouTube, I hadn't planned to make a sixth video today, but I have to because there's news from Venezuela. Some people are claiming that they have begun resorting, in some cases, to eating cats and dogs. I can't confirm that. Venezuela is a censorship-happy socialist feel-the-burn utopia, so we don't necessarily have accurate news from it. Maduro has declared a 60-day state of emergency with the idea that the U.S. or the West at large is trying to cause a coup there. I guess he got the idea that since Dilma Rousseff was out, that obviously, the horrible Western imperialists would be coming for him next. I'd like to point out, of course, Dilma was removed by vote, and that some of those voting to remove her were in fact members of her own party. This is an inconvenient truth to an entrenched socialist elite. Maduro is partly responsible for Venezuela's problems, specifically because the added income of oil sales, which have been sky high for some time, did not roll over into increasing investment into actually trying to increase down the road the output and the efficiency of oil extraction. If that had been done, there would be no crisis right now in Venezuela. Flour and chicken wouldn't be apparently things that people are looting. It's murder rates going up, assault rates going up. The police had to block several massive protests as well in Caracas. What's happening is that people are beginning, social order essentially is beginning to break down. At some point, the law no longer matters because people are desperate enough so that they go down to the base level of human function. Their upper functions become suppressed consciously and subconsciously, and they will simply do what they need to do to survive. Literally, if someone's thirsty enough, they'll tear your head off and drink your blood, essentially. This is what we unfortunately are likely to see in Venezuela now. The former president of Colombia called for, I believe his name is Uribe, called for intervention into Venezuela, basically rhetorically asking whoever has the balls to do it should overthrow Maduro. I think that would be a bad idea. I think it's best to let the Venezuelan people topple their own government, because then nobody can claim it was the result of foreign intervention. And of course, you have a problem in Colombia as well. Not just with the actions of leftist guerrillas in the country, but also those that have massacred civilians and then dressed them up as guerrillas and so forth. So, I mean, there is blame on both sides in the state of Colombia, as there is in Venezuela, let's face it. But Maduro will probably not be in power much longer. This is sort of the last resort, last-ditch effort to maintain what he's got going on. But you've got to realize Maduro is sort of the counterpart to the USSR's problems when they purged the academics that were in charge that knew at least somewhat what they were doing, and put in the Stalinistic era. They put in a bunch of peasants who really didn't know how the things that they were governing actually function. They had no academic training. They had experience at farming. They had experience at, craftsmanship, sort of brute labor and so forth. They didn't necessarily have a good grasp on what else was going on other than the military. Everything else was being run by people who, in many cases, didn't know exactly what they were doing. The problem is that Maduro is a former bus driver. He does not necessarily know anything about oil extraction beyond it funds the welfare programs that he's using to control the population. So I don't expect Maduro will be there for long. He obviously doesn't know what he's doing. He's obviously desperate. He's calling what happened in Brazil a coup because he's hoping that thus his own socialism is exonerated, that at least his fans will rally around him. That will form a bulwark against him being potentially hanged from a tree or dragged through the streets being sodomized like Gaddafi was. Only in the former case, Gaddafi actually knew how to manage a country. Maduro appears not to understand this. I find it funny. Years ago, when Venezuela was largely functioning, that is, the oil was at 120 a barrel or something, and Venezuela was slowly, but it was advancing, and they were selling oil to New York. People made a great big deal about this. Sort of the Bushes hated Venezuela, they hated Chavez. And so the Venezuelans made a big deal about sort of buddy-buddying with some of the Democrats at the state government level. People thought that was great, and Venezuela, for a time, appeared seemingly calm. I remember lots of people back then pointing to it as a glorious example of socialism at work, but now that Venezuela is on the brink of collapse, all of these same people keep telling me it's not actually socialism. So I would ask them, what exactly is it? They've got state control of oil. They use it to fund redistributionist welfare programs. How is that not a form of socialism? How is this? It's certainly not a capitalistic society. Every aspect of life from cradle to grave is administered directly by a central authority. You can't possibly argue that that's a free market system. The prices are fixed, things are largely redistributed to the point where they can't even print money now because the paper it's printed on, even on higher denominations, is worth more than the denominated currency being printed with it. They can't print money. Their beer production is gone. They've got a 2-day work week, and not for the reasons you would think generally. If someone were to posit a society in which people work 2 or 3 days a week, they'd say, oh, well, automation is advanced and things are so prosperous, nobody needs to slave away at drudgery. And if they do, they only do it for 2 days a week. So ultimately, they're happy. 5 days a week, they sleep in, they play video games or whatever, or they eat their fucking Soylent Green or whatnot. Unfortunately, they've done it because specifically their electrical grid is failing. Their hydroelectric system is being compromised by a drought. Their agriculture is is going haywire. They don't have enough food, and now we've got arguably at least a few reports of people eating their own pets out of desperation. Cancer patients can't get cancer drugs. Their maternity wards don't even have air conditioning. How much more can the Venezuelan people possibly take? And how many more socialist regimes have to show their ass with corruption or ineptitude before people wake up to the concept that, no, government, centralized authority in whatever form it takes, whether it's a nationalist system in which the nationalization is for other purposes, ethnic purposes or whatever, or a socialist system which operates in very much the same manner. How many more of these regimes have to fail, collapse? How many more of these tin horn idiots have to be lynched before people understand that government is not a magic bullet to your problems? The concept of redistributionism works when things are going very well. When oil was high enough in price for Venezuela to make a tidy profit extracting and selling its oil, things were just fine in Venezuela. Not a single attempt by the Venezuelan government was ever made to take any of that money and do anything with it other than subsidize luxury goods and food staples for the people at large. That's great as long as things are going well, because the people are happy. You can point to your model and say, look at how great socialism is. Our people work less and everyone's got free this and free that, and they don't have to worry where their next meal is coming from, even if things are a little bit slummy in some areas. Okay, great. Now, when your monocultured economy suffers a systemic collapse because the oil price is, I think, now like 15-20% of what it was a few years ago, you don't even now have the money to fund all of those welfare programs that allowed you to control the population in the first place. The Europeans, beware. It's not going to continue working. The state of Venezuela is teetering on the brink of such a situation now that you may literally begin to see human-on-human cannibalism in the state of Venezuela. People have already begun to loot. People have already begun to march by the tens of thousands. It's difficult in a socialist nation where someone like Maduro is so heavily entrenched. It's rather difficult to get people to protest at all because you've always got the risk of being dragged off to a re-education camp. By the way, yes, there are socialist countries that aren't run by tyrants. That doesn't mean that their economy, if monocultured, is going to last any longer. Even a capitalistic nation would have difficulty in a monocultured economic system maintaining the system that Venezuela has now. The redistributionism is what, though, led to the situation that they're currently facing. I would be very surprised if Nicolas Maduro is still in power come July. I would be somewhat surprised if he doesn't end up dead. And I think perhaps for the average Venezuelan, it would be just as well if somebody took a pot shot at him and succeeded. Because clearly, when someone becomes paranoid enough to declare that a democratically held vote backed by 80% of the population of Brazil is illegitimate and constitutes a coup because somebody was caught embezzling millions of dollars and then cracked down on their own population and they get forced out. When somebody becomes that paranoid, they begin to look a lot like Joseph Stalin or something like that. Obviously, the neighbors of Venezuela don't really want the state to get to such a desperate state where refugees end up flooding out of Venezuela across what will become porous borders as guards abandon their posts because they're tired of it too. And in all of these situations, you see what ends up happening. The military and the police, the strong arm, essentially state-run gangs of whoever's in power, are the last to starve. They're the ones given the best food, and they've got the ammo and the guns. You've got a largely disarmed Venezuelan population. Things will begin to get bloody. So while I don't think that the international community should march in force and blow Maduro's head off and drag him into the ocean and dump his fly-ridden corpse out there, I do think that someone needs to have some sort of contingency in place for when things very likely collapse there. Because the world is not going to sit idly by while you start hearing the odd report of cannibalism and things start burning and the oil rigs stop functioning and the state essentially ceases to exist. Because at that point, somebody else, not necessarily with good intentions, will march in. It behooves the Western world to make sure that when that happens, that it's the Western world attempting to restore some semblance of order. Preferably, the other Latin American states would do this. Obviously, there are those in Colombia who feel that it might become necessary. Maybe the Brazilians would step in. Either way, the United States can't sit by and let a nation in the American hemisphere under the auspices of the Monroe Doctrine simply collapse into cannibalism and anarchy, especially a state with so massive an oil reserve that the Chinese or the Russians would absolutely love to send in a few destroyers, take a few shots at a few people, land some troops, declare it a satellite state, and install a puppet government, which they arguably could do. The Venezuelan military is not exactly the most well-oiled machine on the face of the earth. So Maduro should go, hopefully his own domestic population, rather than relapsing into barbarism and eating each other and burning their own cities to the ground, will funnel their rage at him. They'll kick him out, they'll put him in jail, they'll kill him, whatever they need to do. They'll wipe out what's left of his government, ban his party, and they'll restore order and some semblance of decency. Hopefully as well, those that are pissed at the Venezuelans because socialism here in the United States have exactly the wrong idea. The people there need to be liberated out from under it, not continuously punished. What we should do is pump money into the Venezuelan economy, get the rigs working again, modernize things so they can turn a profit. We won't have this problem again. We'll have a steady ally in Latin America that we can count on. Abusing a people that's already to the point where they're potentially eating their pets is not a particularly good idea. It'll make us look more barbarous than Maduro ever was. And a lot of Venezuelans are already convinced that every problem that goes on in their country is somehow the result of the United States. We didn't collapse the oil prices. We didn't tell them, take this money you're making from your oil rigs and fail to invest it in furthering your machinery of the economy so that you can actually pay for things when times aren't so good. Therein lies the problem of state planning. The state will inevitably plan its budget in accordance with its maximized profit. When the profit goes down, when the monocultured economy suffers, or there's a famine, or the oil rig blows up, they don't know how to handle it other than debt. Therein is the problem of the style of socialism in place in the state of Venezuela. So hopefully Maduro gets shot or hanged off a tree very soon before his people begin to die off in droves. If not, the international community is really not going to have a choice. Like if a million North Koreans suddenly starved and we got reports of cannibalism out of the DPRK, and I don't mean like the once a year somebody was really hungry report, I mean, systemic hysteria and the total breakdown of order, I guarantee you somebody would be marching across the DMZ, whether it's the Chinese, the Russians, or the United States and its allies, really makes no difference. That sort of thing generally draws international condemnation. Now, will the UN do anything? No, the UN's fucked up. The UN shouldn't even be involved in foreign affairs. The UN shouldn't do anything. It should just ban for the most part. they're about the least effectual fighting force on the face of the earth. People talk about worrying about the UN invading the United States. They wouldn't last an hour against just private citizens with shotguns and hunting rifles. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. The Venezuelans should worry, though, because they're disarmed and their own government will potentially massacre them in order to hold on to power. Through an oil price crisis that, let's face it, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Doesn't matter how many Canadian oil sands wildfires there are. It doesn't matter what happens in the Middle East. Oil prices are going to stay low for quite some time to come. Venezuela will collapse. It's just a matter of when. That's about all. Peace out.